Other forms of writing are, we talk about taking poetic license. That phrase is intended to portray that we're going to say things in a little different way so that we're able to write poetry. Okay? So the Psalms are poetries. We've got to keep that in mind. Not only that, it takes into account the historical context. It's important when I'm studying the Psalm that I realize the Psalms were not written over a period of a month or so. Okay? The Psalms is a collection of songs, so to speak, from the Old Testament period. Most of them, many of them were written by David. Asaph wrote some. A lot of different writers over an extended period of time. It's important that I not only know that the psalm is poetry, but I also know that the particular psalm that I'm studying, to have an idea as best I can what period of the Old Testament it was written in. That's going to give me clues into knowing some of the connections that the writer may be making with historical events that are happening at the time that he wrote that psalm. A perfect example, Psalm 38. We use it in counseling all the time when we're dealing with people that are suffering depression and things like that. The psalm gives us a wonderful clue right there in the beginning. It tells us that David wrote this down after he had fallen into sin. As far as the deal with Bathsheba. So we automatically make the historical connection to what was going on in David's life. That is beginning the process of understanding the passage, understanding what kind of literature it is, understanding the historical context in which they're writing to help us understand what's being said. Not only that, it focuses on the grammar, in other words, the sentence structure itself, and the syntax, the textual variants. I know that scares some people, but it also takes into account the different, especially in the New Testament, some of the different texts that have been uncovered. If there are variations in some of the wording of the text, it takes those into account to try to better understand some of the scribal writings in the margins. It looks at all those things to try to help to better understand what the passage is saying. It also looks at word meanings. In other words, it takes the individual words and defines them. Figures of speech. Begins to say some of those things I was talking about earlier. It begins to say, now, is this part of a figure of speech, this word, or is it to be taken completely literally by its actual definition? How do I understand these words? And then it takes into account biblical theology. In other words, it places, after you have arrived at what you believe to be the meaning of that passage by all of these other things, then it fits them within the overall biblical theology and says, does that fit, or am I coming away with something that contradicts the overall biblical theology? And then it also reduces it down from there and says, from what I understand about the particular author of this book, the human author of this book, is it saying something that would contradict what he commonly teaches, his common understanding? And it puts all those together to arrive at the meaning of the text. And now there's other things that go on there, but that's the basic understanding of the study. Now, from that, we have another form of study called the canonical contextual. Canonical contextual study, and this is the study that is growing right now. This is the area that is really producing a lot of fruit that we haven't understood before. It studies a passage's literary allusions to other scripture. In other words, after I've done all this other footwork in the grammatical historical, I also then began to study this passage looking for the allusions, the quotations, common words, common themes that appear between it and other passages previous to it. Now, it's important to understand that, previous to it. In other words, you can't allude to a passage that's coming along after. Do we understand that? If you read a passage in the Old Testament and then go over to the New Testament in Matthew, and Matthew uses a word or a phrase that you find in common with an Old Testament passage, you can't say that the Old Testament writer alludes to something in Matthew. He can't allude to something that wasn't yet. But you can say Matthew is alluding to something in the Old Testament. That's the reason it's important, especially when you're studying the New Testament or sayings or writings that are common in the New Testament, or sayings and quotations common in the Old Testament, that you know when those books were written. Because it's going to determine which one is alluding to the other, which one is working off the other. You can get it backwards, is what I'm saying. And you can come away with some messed up ideas if you're not careful. Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the closing of the quotation? I mean, of the... Did I miss something? Yeah, it's going to be quotations of, I'm sorry, I missed that somehow. Yeah, but it is quotations. Thank you, Don. And notice what I said now here. It could be it could be a quotation of the Old Testament in the Old Testament. It could be a quotation of the Old Testament in the New Testament, or it could be a quotation of the New Testament in the New Testament. But it holds true all the way through. Okay? So the goal then is to go beyond what we might call just the surface meaning of the individual words. And that is one of the dangers of simply using, and again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it is not vitally important that we use the grammatical historical method of interpretation, but we can't stop there. We have to continue on and combine that with the canonical contextual interpretation so that we don't miss those vital allusions and connections of later passages back to earlier passages. And that is the area that is growing right now in textual study, is recognizing these allusions. I don't know if you've looked at Carson's book, but if you go back and look at his book, the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, when I first got the book, I'm thinking, well, there's quite a few books in the New Testament. I guess it would take up this much room to list all the quotations. And then you open that bad boy up, and you look at one book of the New Testament, and I mean, Hebrews is like 200 and something pages just to cover all of the different times that the book of Hebrews alludes to or quotes the Old Testament. And literally, you can't hardly get past a verse in the book of Hebrews, and Revelation is even worse, that there is not some kind of allusion back to an Old Testament text. And sometimes it's only just a word, but it's the way that word appears, the form that that word is used, and how it's used in connection with the rest of the sentence that causes in their study now for them to see and understand, wait a minute, he's making a reference back to an Old Testament passage.